Police chief's black son caught breaking the law. Officer faces a tough decision. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Officer Jake Reynolds drove his patrol car through the well-to-do neighborhood, his headlights slicing through the darkness. The street was lined with meticulously maintained homes, each one a testament to affluence and order. Jake's gaze wandered over the pristine lawns and high-end vehicles, a stark contrast to the less affluent parts of town he was used to patrolling. The serenity of the night was interrupted by the sudden appearance of a group of teens hanging out near the entrance of a gated driveway. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he slowed his car, watching them closely. There were 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, all seemingly engaged in animated conversation. He couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but their demeanor suggested they were up to something. Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he pulled over, the car's engine rumbling to a halt. He stepped out of the vehicle, the cool night air hitting him as he approached the group. They looked up, their conversations halting abruptly. Jake could feel their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and unease. "What are you guys up to this late?" Jake asked, his tone more curt than he intended. His eyes flicked over each of them, lingering just a moment longer on the boy who stood slightly apart from the others. There was something about him, an air of defensiveness, maybe, that caught Jake's attention. The girl, who appeared to be the most confident of the group, spoke up. "We're just hanging out. Nothing wrong with that, right?" Jake nodded, his gaze shifting back to the boy who had caught his eye. "Mind if I take a look at what you're carrying? Just want to make sure everything's okay." The boy hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "We're not doing anything illegal," he said, though there was an edge of defensiveness in his voice. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he began to inspect the area around them more closely. His eyes scanned the ground, and that's when he noticed something, a small, crumpled bag lying half buried in the grass near where the boy was standing. He reached down, picked it up, and opened it carefully. The contents were immediately recognizable, a small amount of what appeared to be marijuana. "Care to explain this?" Jake asked, holding up the bag for the group to see. The tension among them was palpable now, the carefree facade quickly dissolving into nervousness. The boy, who had been standing apart, stepped forward, his face pale. It's not mine. I was just trying to help my friend here." Jake's mind raced. He'd seen these kinds of situations before, kids trying to protect their friends, making excuses and the like, but this felt different, more personal somehow. The boy's earnestness struck a chord with him, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. "Let me see some ID," Jake said, trying to maintain a professional demeanor despite the growing unease he felt. The boy fumbled in his pocket and handed over a driver's license. Jake glanced at it and then back at the boy. The name on the ID was Marcus Allen. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Marcus Allen, Chief Allen's son. The realization hit him like a jolt. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. Chief Allen had been a mentor to him, a figure of respect and authority in the department. The thought of being involved in a situation that directly implicated Allen's son made his stomach churn. He glanced back at the group, his gaze lingering on Marcus. "I need to call this in," Jake said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He reached for his radio, his fingers trembling slightly as he keyed in the emergency code. As he waited for a response, Jake's thoughts were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He respected Chief Allen deeply and had always admired his commitment to justice and fairness. The thought of potentially tearing apart the very fabric of the man's family weighed heavily on him. A response crackled through the radio, and Jake relayed the details of the situation, requesting backup. He kept a close eye on Marcus and his friends, noting their increasing anxiety. The girl was now clutching her phone, trying to text someone urgently, while the other boy was staring at the ground, avoiding eye contact. Minutes felt like hours as they waited for backup to arrive. Jake tried to keep the conversation with the group going, making small talk to ease the tension, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but think about how this incident could affect everyone involved, from Marcus and his friends to Chief Allen himself. When the backup arrived, Jake felt a mix of relief and dread. The additional officers began to take control of the situation, and Jake briefed them on what he had discovered. As they began to handle the formalities, Jake took a moment to step away from the scene, his thoughts consumed by the gravity of the situation. He stood by his patrol car, looking out at the quiet neighborhood, feeling a deep sense of unease. This wasn't just another routine stop, it was a moment that could have far-reaching consequences. Jake knew that whatever happened next would not only affect Marcus and his friends, but also have a significant impact on his career and the department as a whole. As the night dragged on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of something significant. The tension between his professional responsibilities and personal respect for Chief Allen was palpable, and he knew that the choices made in the coming hours would be crucial. The quiet neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter in the unfolding drama. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the quiet neighborhood. Officer Jake Reynolds continued his patrol, the earlier encounter still weighing heavily on him. His mind replayed the scene with Marcus and his friends, the crumpled bag of drugs, a persistent reminder of the decisions he would soon have to make. As Jake approached the area where he had first spotted the group, he could see the police lights reflecting off the nearby houses. He parked his patrol car a short distance away and walked towards the scene, his heart heavy with apprehension. The backup officers were already on site, talking to the teens and beginning their initial assessments. Jake spotted Marcus sitting on the curb, looking more vulnerable than ever. His hands were resting on his knees, and his face was a mask of worry and confusion. Kyle, the other boy from the group, was standing nearby, his expression a mix of defiance and fear. Kyle's demeanor was noticeably different from Marcus's. He seemed more guarded, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. Jake approached the officer in charge of the scene, Officer Martinez, who was reviewing the evidence. "What have we got, Martinez?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Martinez looked up, her expression serious. "We found the drugs in the bag Marcus was holding, but there's more to this story. Kyle here has been giving us some conflicting information." Jake's gaze shifted to Kyle. "Conflicting information?" Martinez nodded. "Yeah. He's been saying he doesn't know much about the drugs, but his story doesn't quite add up. He's been acting pretty nervous." Jake turned his attention back to Kyle, trying to gauge the boy's true emotions. Kyle's face was flushed and his hands trembled slightly. Jake could see the tension in his posture, a stark contrast to Marcus's visible distress. "Kyle," Jake said, his tone firm but not unkind, "why don't you tell me what's going on here? We need to get to the bottom of this." Kyle swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with a mix of shame and frustration. I didn't mean for this to happen. I got involved with some guys who were dealing drugs. I didn't think it would go this far." Jake's expression softened slightly, though his mind was racing. Kyle's admission was troubling, but it also revealed a more complex situation than he had initially understood. The boy wasn't just a guilty party. He was someone who had fallen into a dangerous situation, possibly out of desperation or poor judgment. "Why were you hanging out with Marcus and the others?" Jake asked, trying to piece together the connections. "What was your plan?" Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "I was just trying to lay low. You know, Marcus didn't have anything to do with the drugs. He hesitated, glancing at Marcus. "I was trying to protect him. He's a good guy. I didn't want him to get caught up in this mess." Jake's mind raced as he processed Kyle's words. The situation was more tangled than he had anticipated. He felt a pang of guilt as he realized how quickly he had jumped to conclusions about Marcus. The boy's involvement, or lack thereof, wasn't as clear-cut as Jake had initially assumed. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Chief Allen appeared, his face a mixture of concern and authority. He took in the scene with a quick, practiced glance, and his eyes settled on Jake. "Jake, what's going on?" Allen asked, his voice carrying a note of urgency. Jake took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "Chief, we found a bag of drugs with Marcus, but Kyle here has just admitted that he's been involved with dealing, like Marcus was trying to protect him." Allen's expression darkened as he turned to Kyle. "Is this true? Were you dealing drugs?" Kyle nodded, his face a picture of regret. Yeah, I got caught up in it. I didn't want to drag Marcus into it, but I didn't have a choice. Alan's gaze shifted back to Jake, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and empathy. So, Marcus was just trying to help his friend. We need to figure out how to handle this situation. It's not as simple as it seemed. Jake nodded, feeling a heavy weight lift from his shoulders. The realization that Marcus had been caught in the crossfire rather than being directly involved in criminal activity was a relief, but it also deepened the complexity of the situation. Alan took a moment to address the group of teens, his voice calm but authoritative. Marcus, Kyle, I need you both to understand that this is a serious matter. We're going to have to handle it with care, especially given the circumstances. Kyle, you're going to have to face the consequences of your actions. As for Marcus, we need to have a serious talk about what's happened. Jake watched as Alan spoke with the teens, his internal conflict mirroring the complexity of the case. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, knowing that the decisions they made now would have lasting repercussions for everyone involved. As the night wore on, Jake worked alongside Alan and the other officers to ensure that the situation was handled with the necessary care and attention. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jake was determined to navigate the delicate balance between enforcing the law and understanding the personal struggles of the individuals involved. By the time the early hours of the morning approached, Jake felt a sense of exhaustion mingled with relief. The immediate crisis had been addressed, but the real challenge lay ahead. The decisions made in the coming days would determine the course of justice for Marcus and Kyle, and Jake knew that every choice would have far-reaching consequences. As he prepared to leave the scene, Jake glanced back at Marcus and Kyle, both looking worn and reflective. The night had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, but it had also been a stark reminder of the complexities of justice and the impact of individual actions. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake was committed to seeing it through with integrity and empathy. The incident underscored the need for careful consideration and a commitment to fairness, even in the face of difficult decisions. The station was quiet as dawn began to break, casting a soft light through the windows. Inside Chief Allen's office, the air was thick with tension. Jake Reynolds sat across from Allen, his posture rigid and his eyes weary. The events of the previous night had left him grappling with an immense burden. Allen looked equally troubled. His usually composed demeanor was marred by the strain of the situation. The office was filled with paperwork, but it was the weight of their conversation that occupied most of the room. So, what do you think we should do, Jake? Allen's voice was steady, but the underlying frustration and concern were palpable. Jake rubbed his temples, trying to clear his mind. Chief, He struggled to find the right words. I don't know. Marcus was just trying to protect his friend. He wasn't directly involved in dealing drugs. But at the same time, we have to consider the seriousness of the situation. Allen nodded, his eyes reflecting the internal conflict he was experiencing. As a father, I want to protect Marcus and shield him from the consequences of Kyle's actions. But as a police chief, I have to uphold the law and ensure that justice is served. The duality of Allen's position was evident. The weight of being both a father and a police chief was a heavy burden, and it showed on his face. He glanced at a framed photo on his desk, Marcus smiling at a family event. It was a poignant reminder of the personal stakes involved. I'm torn, Jake, Allen admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I know Marcus made a mistake by being involved in this, but he wasn't the one dealing drugs. He was trying to help Kyle. Yet, I can't ignore the fact that he had illegal substances. Jake could see the pain in Allen's eyes, like a reflection of the turmoil he felt as a father caught between his professional obligations and personal loyalties. I get it, Chief. This isn't easy. But if we let Marcus go without any consequences, it might set a dangerous precedent. People might think they can get away with things just because of who they are. Allen nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of Jake's point. I know, and it's not about favoritism or leniency. It's about finding a balance between fairness and accountability. Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the possible outcomes. The decision weighed heavily on him. He thought about Marcus, an intelligent young man caught in a difficult situation, and about his role in potentially altering the course of his life. "I keep thinking about the message we're sending," Jake said, his voice tinged with frustration. "If we don't act, are we failing to enforce the law? But if we do act, are we punishing someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time?" Alan's gaze softened as he looked at Jake. "We need to make a decision that we can both live with, something that balances justice with understanding." As they continued their discussion, Marcus was waiting in an adjacent room, his face etched with anxiety. The uncertainty of his fate loomed over him, adding to the emotional weight of the situation. He had spent the night reflecting on his actions and the potential consequences, and the fear of disappointing his father was overwhelming. When Jake and Alan finally emerged from the office, the tension in the room was palpable. Jake took a deep breath, his heart pounding. Alan placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity amidst the difficult decision they were about to make. Alan entered the room where Marcus was waiting. The young man looked up, his eyes full of trepidation. Alan's expression was a mix of fatherly concern and professional resolve. "Marcus," Alan began, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "we've had a long discussion about what happened last night. We understand the circumstances, but there are consequences to be faced." Marcus's face fell, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to help Kyle." Alan nodded, his heart breaking for his son. "I know, Marcus, but the law is the law. We have to take this seriously." Jake stepped forward, his own emotions in turmoil. "Marcus, I want you to understand that this isn't about punishing you for the sake of it. It's about making sure you learn from this experience and that we uphold the standards we're expected to." Marcus looked up at Jake, his eyes searching for understanding. "So what happens now?" Jake took a moment to gather his thoughts. "We're going to handle this with as much fairness as possible. You won't face formal charges, but you will be required to attend counseling and community service. You must understand the gravity of the situation and work to make amends." Marcus's relief was palpable, but the emotional toll of the past few hours was evident. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." Alan placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, trying to offer comfort amidst the uncertainty. "We'll get through this, Marcus. I'm proud of you for owning up to your part in this and for trying to protect your friend." As Marcus left the station, Jake and Alan stood in silence, both feeling the weight of the decision they had made. The resolution had been difficult, but it was a compromise that sought to balance justice with empathy. Jake knew that the case was far from over. The investigation into Kyle's activities would continue, and the repercussions of their decisions would be felt for some time. But for now, the immediate crisis had been addressed, and Marcus had been given a chance to redeem himself. Alan turned to Jake, his expression reflecting both relief and exhaustion. "Thanks for helping me through this, Jake. It wasn't easy, but I think we did the right thing." Jake nodded, his sense of relief mingled with the emotional weight of the situation. "I hope so, Chief. It's been a tough decision, but I believe we've done our best." As they walked out of the station, the early morning light cast a hopeful glow over the town. The road ahead would be challenging, but both Jake and Alan were determined to navigate it with integrity and compassion. The case had been a test of their professional and personal values, and they were committed to moving forward with a renewed sense of purpose and understanding. The interrogation room was cold and stark, illuminated by a single overhead light. Marcus sat alone at the table, his hands fidgeting nervously as he stared at the unyielding surface. The silence was punctuated only by the distant hum of the station's heating system and the occasional murmur of voices in the hallway. Jake Reynolds stood in the corner, observing Marcus with a mixture of sympathy and concern. The night had been a whirlwind, and now, as the dawn light filtered through the narrow window, the weight of the situation seemed even heavier. Marcus had been waiting for what felt like hours, his mind racing with thoughts of his father, his friends, and the decisions that lay ahead. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the escalating pressure he felt. Jake stepped forward, breaking the silence. "Marcus, you don't have to go through this alone. If there's something more you need to tell us, now's the time." Marcus looked up, his eyes red and puffy from lack of sleep and emotional strain. He was wrestling with something, his face a mask of internal conflict. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and constricted. I don't know where to start. Jake took a seat across from Marcus, his demeanor calm but earnest. Just be honest with us. We're here to understand, not to judge. The door opened and Chief Allen walked in, his face a picture of resolve mixed with personal turmoil. He glanced at Marcus, his eyes filled with concern and a flicker of fatherly worry. Allen took a seat beside Jake, the weight of his dual roles pressing down on him. Allen's voice was steady, but tinged with an undertone of emotion. Marcus, I need you to know that whatever you say, we're going to handle it with care. We want to get to the bottom of this, but we also need to understand the whole story. Marcus nodded, though his anxiety was palpable. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The room felt suffocating, each second dragging as he battled with his conscience. The truth was a heavy burden, and the fear of its consequences loomed large. Marcus began, his voice trembling. I didn't want to get anyone in trouble. I was trying to protect Kyle. Jake and Allen exchanged a glance, sensing that there was more to the story. Allen's gaze was intense, reflecting his struggle between his role as a father and his professional responsibilities. What do you mean, protect Kyle? Jake asked, his curiosity piqued. What was Kyle involved in? Marcus hesitated, the internal battle evident on his face. His fingers drummed nervously on the table as he searched for the right words. Kyle's been involved in dealing drugs. I didn't know how deep it went at first. When I found out, I tried to stay away, but he kept coming around. Allen's expression hardened, his face a mask of both disappointment and concern. And you were caught with the drugs. Why did you have them? Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to speak. I was holding on to them for Kyle. I didn't want to be involved, but he begged me. I was trying to help him out and keep him safe. I didn't want to get him in more trouble or risk him getting hurt. The confession was a heavy blow. Jake's mind raced as he processed the new information. The complexity of the situation was unfolding in a way he hadn't anticipated. Marcus had been caught in a difficult position, torn between loyalty to a friend and the harsh reality of the law. Allen's face was a study in conflict. As a father, he was deeply hurt by Marcus's involvement, but as a police chief, he had to confront the implications of Marcus's actions. The struggle was written all over his face, a mix of paternal concern and professional duty. So, you were trying to protect him, even though you knew it was wrong? Allen's voice was strained, trying to maintain control over his emotions. Marcus nodded, tears streaming down his face. I was afraid of what might happen if I didn't. I didn't want to see him get hurt or get into more trouble. I thought I could handle it, but it just got worse. Jake took a deep breath, his mind working through the implications of Marcus's confession. This changes things. We need to address Kyle's involvement more seriously now. Allen's gaze softened as he looked at Marcus. You're going to have to face the consequences of your actions, but I'm glad you came forward. It took courage to admit the truth. Marcus's shoulders sagged in relief, but the emotional weight of the situation remained. I just wanted to do the right thing. I didn't want to make everything worse. Allen placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder, his voice filled with a mix of paternal warmth and professional resolve. We'll get through this, Marcus. We'll have to face the repercussions, but we'll work through it together. Jake nodded, adding his own words of reassurance. We're going to make sure everything is handled fairly. You'll need to be honest and cooperate fully as we move forward. As Allen and Jake prepared to handle the next steps, the emotional weight of the confession lingered in the room. Marcus had revealed the truth, but the journey ahead was fraught with challenges and difficult decisions. The path forward was uncertain, but the commitment to justice and understanding remained steadfast. Jake and Allen knew that the resolution of the case would be complex, involving careful consideration and empathy for everyone involved. The station was quieter now, the morning bustle having settled into a subdued hum. Chief Allen's office was a sanctuary of sorts, though today it was fraught with tension and unresolved emotions. Allen sat behind his desk, staring at the framed photo of Marcus that sat prominently on his desk. The image of his son, smiling and carefree, felt like a stark contrast to the reality of their situation. Allen glanced up as Marcus entered the room, his face a mix of shame and anxiety. Alan gestured for him to sit, his expression reflecting a deep emotional struggle. The air between them was thick with the weight of unspoken words and unresolved conflict. "Marcus," Alan began, his voice unsteady, "I want you to know how hard this is for me. As your father, I'm heartbroken. But as your chief, I have to make decisions that affect everyone, including you." Marcus sat down, his eyes meeting his father's with a mixture of regret and fear. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought I could help Kyle, but it just went wrong." Alan's eyes softened, his voice breaking slightly as he struggled to maintain composure. "I understand that you were trying to do the right thing, but you have to realize the gravity of the situation. Kyle's actions are serious, and so are the consequences." Marcus nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I know, Dad. I should have known better. I didn't want to cause you pain or get myself into trouble. I just didn't know how to handle it." Alan leaned forward, his hands resting on the desk, his voice thick with emotion. "Marcus, it's not just about the trouble you're in. It's about the trust we've built over the years. I've always tried to guide you, protect you, and support you. Now, it feels like everything is unraveling." The raw vulnerability in Alan's voice was evident. His struggle as a father lay bare. He was torn between his professional responsibilities and his deep love for his son. The internal battle was palpable, and the emotional weight was nearly overwhelming. "I know this isn't easy for you," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "I'm just so sorry for putting you in this position. I didn't want to disappoint you." Alan reached out, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder, trying to offer comfort amidst the storm of emotions. "We're going to get through this, Marcus, but it's important to face the consequences of your actions. We have to show that we take these matters seriously, even when it's personal." The door to the office opened, and Kyle was escorted in by another officer. His demeanor was subdued, his face showing the strain of the situation. Alan's gaze shifted from Marcus to Kyle, the weight of his role as both father and police chief pressing heavily on him. Kyle's eyes met Marcus's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of guilt and regret in Kyle's expression. "I'm sorry, Marcus," Kyle said quietly. "I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. I never wanted to drag you into this." Alan's voice was firm, but laced with emotion as he addressed Kyle. "Kyle, the consequences for your actions are significant. This isn't just about you getting caught. It's about the impact on everyone involved, including Marcus. You're going to have to face the legal ramifications of your actions." Kyle nodded, his face a mix of resignation and remorse. "I understand. I'm ready to face whatever comes next." Alan's gaze softened as he looked at Kyle, his paternal instincts at war with his professional duties. "I hope you realize the gravity of what you've done and use this as a turning point in your life." As Kyle was led away, Alan turned his attention back to Marcus, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Marcus, we need to talk about what comes next. You'll need to attend counseling and community service. You must understand the seriousness of your actions and work to make amends." Marcus nodded, his shoulders slumping as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. "I'll do whatever it takes. I want to make things right." Alan's voice was filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow as he spoke. "I know you will, and we'll be here to support you through it." As Marcus left the office, Jake Reynolds lingered in the doorway, watching the exchange with a conflicted expression. He had been part of the decision-making process, but the emotional toll of the situation was still weighing heavily on him. Alan glanced at Jake, his expression a mix of fatigue and frustration. "Jake, this hasn't been easy. I appreciate your support through all of this." Jake nodded, though his internal conflict was far from resolved. "I'm just trying to do what's right, Chief. It's been a difficult situation, and I'm not sure I'm completely at peace with the decisions we've made." Alan's gaze was understanding, a reflection of his struggle. "I know. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't come with immediate clarity or comfort. It's about making the best decisions we can with the information we have." Jake sighed, his mind still wrestling with doubts. "I hope we've done enough to make things right. It's hard to see the bigger picture sometimes, especially when it's so personal." Alan placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "We'll keep working to address these issues and support those affected. It's not about having all the answers right now." It's about continuing to strive for justice and understanding. As they left the office, the early afternoon light cast a somber glow over the station. The emotional intensity of the day had taken its toll on both men. They were committed to navigating the complexities of the situation with integrity, but the road ahead was uncertain. Jake's reflection on the events left him with lingering doubts, the weight of the decisions still heavy on his shoulders. Alan, too, faced the challenge of reconciling his personal and professional responsibilities. The path forward was fraught with challenges, but both men were resolved to continue their efforts, guided by a sense of duty and a desire for justice. The soft hum of the station's air conditioning was the only sound filling the room as Jake Daniels sat at his desk, the fading light of dusk painting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the city was alive with its usual bustle, but inside the station, Jake felt the quiet weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. Chief Allen's words lingered, but they weren't enough to lift the heaviness that had settled in his chest. He stared at the photograph of Alan and Marcus on his desk, a subtle but constant reminder of the personal and professional boundaries he had crossed and blurred. This wasn't about a single mistake or a fleeting moment of bias. This was about the system that had allowed him, and so many others before him, to make decisions clouded by assumptions, unconscious or not. The sensitivity training, the workshops, the moments of introspection, it all felt like a bandage on a wound that ran far deeper than he had ever realized. This wasn't just about him. It was about an entire structure built on inequity, one that he had become a part of without even recognizing it. For years, Jake had prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules, who treated people fairly. But now he understood that fairness was not the same for everyone, and the rules weren't written with everyone in mind. His decisions, even with good intentions, had hurt people. And those people were still out there, living with the consequences of a system that failed to protect them. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, there was a knock at the door. Officer Daniels, an older, grizzled cop with decades on the force, poked his head in. His usual air of confidence was gone, replaced by something more subdued, almost uncertain. "Jake," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "You coming to the meeting tonight?" Jake had almost forgotten. Tonight was the first of many community forums the department had organized in response to the outcry after Marcus's arrest. Yet the forums were intended to be a space where the community could air their grievances, where police officers would sit and listen, not defend themselves, not explain away their actions, but truly listen to the people they had sworn to serve. Jake had been dreading it all week. "Yeah, I'll be there," Jake replied, standing slowly, feeling the ache in his bones from the emotional toll the last few weeks had taken. The weight of his uniform felt heavier than usual, as though it carried not just his own guilt, but the guilt of an entire department, an entire system. Officer Daniels lingered at the door for a moment, his face conflicted. "You think this is going to change anything?" he asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Jake paused, considering the question. He wanted to say yes, but deep down he knew that change wouldn't come quickly or easily. "I don't know," Jake said honestly, "but we've got to start somewhere." Daniels nodded and left without another word, leaving Jake alone once more. He glanced at the clock. It was time. With a deep breath, he grabbed his hat and walked out of his office. In the hallway, he spotted Chief Allen waiting near the door to the meeting room. Allen looked exhausted, the lines on his face more pronounced than ever, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. They hadn't spoken much since that night in the station when Marcus's fate had hung in the balance, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now. "Ready?" Allen asked, his voice low but steady. Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure if anyone could ever truly be ready for what was coming. "I guess we'll see," he said, offering a small, grim smile. Together, they walked into the meeting room. It was packed. Chairs lined every wall, filled with people from all walks of life, young, old, black, white, Latino, Asian. The tension in the air was palpable. Eyes followed them as they entered, some filled with anger, others with skepticism, and a few with cautious hope. The community had shown up. They weren't here for empty promises or platitudes. They were here for answers, for accountability, for real lasting change. Jake took a seat near the front, his stomach churning as the meeting began. The moderator, a respected community leader, opened the floor for anyone to speak. It didn't take long for the first person to stand up, a middle-aged black woman who held herself with quiet dignity. Her voice trembled with anger and frustration as she recounted her son's experiences with police harassment. "I've been coming to these meetings for years," she said, her voice rising. "And every time it's the same thing. You all sit here and nod your heads. You promise us things will change, but out there," she pointed toward the window out into the city streets, "out there, nothing changes. My son is still afraid to walk home at night. I'm still afraid every time he leaves the house." Her words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He'd heard stories like hers before, but something about hearing it in this room, surrounded by his fellow officers, made it feel different, more personal, more urgent. As the meeting continued, more people stood up to speak. Some were calm, others were furious. But the message was the same. The community had lost faith in the police. And Jake realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just about fixing individual officers like him. It was about dismantling the entire culture that had allowed these injustices to thrive. When the moderator called for the officers to respond, Jake felt his heart pound in his chest. He stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the back of his chair. "I hear you," he began, his voice unsteady. "I hear all of you, and I know that no amount of words can make up for the fear, the pain, and the anger you've experienced. I've been part of this system for years, and I didn't truly realize, true deeply it's failed you. How deeply I've failed you." He paused, glancing at Alan, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "I won't stand here and promise that things will change overnight," Jake continued. "I won't tell you that I have all the answers, but I will tell you this. I'm committed to doing better, not just for myself, but for this department, for this community. I'm committed to listening, to learning, and to holding myself and my fellow officers accountable." The room was silent for a moment, the tension thick. Then the woman who had spoken earlier stood up again. She looked Jake in the eye, her expression softening just a fraction. "I hope you mean that," she said quietly, "because we can't afford for you not to." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. He sat back down, his hands still shaking. This was just the beginning. There would be more meetings like this, more difficult conversations, more nights spent questioning his role in a system that was fundamentally broken. Change wouldn't come easily, it wouldn't come quickly, but for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was on the right path. And as he sat in that room, surrounded by people who had every reason not to trust him, he realized that his journey and the department's was far from over. The real work had just begun. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content that tackles important issues and promotes positive change. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that matter. Thanks for watching.